Hello, it's Rick again, and this time we're going to discuss Noah's Ark. To be honest, I'm not a real big fan of this story. And as I indicated earlier, folks who don't believe in God like to go straight to Genesis to substantiate the fact that what the Bible is saying couldn't possibly come true. And as I said, these earlier stories, you can take them literally, but specifically the ones that I've covered so far in Noah's Ark, unless you're basically ignoring science and a little common sense, it's difficult to take those literally. But they can be taken as parables, as stories that teach us lessons, which is kind of like what I'm coming from. Also, there's a seed of truth in these stories. For example, although I don't think it took God 6 days to create everything, looking at the scientific evidence, I think it took quite a bit longer. But I do believe God did create everything, from the universe to Earth to human beings. So I am consistent in that fact. Also, when we speak of Adam and Eve, I do think God created human beings, even though the story of Adam and Eve literally I don't take as fact. Anyway, I've also, we're going to speak of Noah's Ark, and Noah's Ark is a prime example of something I pointed out to my students, that I believe the Old Testament, just speaking very generally, when they spoke of sin, there was always punishment to follow. Whereas in the New Testament, which is all about Jesus, he seeks forgiveness. And Noah's Ark is kind of an extreme of that. But before I really get into it, I wanted to kind of give us a little background of the timeline that we've already spoken of, and where we're going with the next story. The Bible actually speaks of generations, and by that, scholars are able to determine when things took place according to the Bible. For example, it's generally believed that creation of everything, that's the 6 days that we spoke of earlier, was back in 4004 BC. BC meaning before Christ was born. So since we're in 2026 now, you can add 2026 to that, as far as how far back it was. And the Bible also stated that Adam lived about 1,000 years. And I kind of went into this a little earlier, whether I believe that people lived as long as it's stated in the Bible or not. I don't know. I tried to rationalize it in my Sunday school class, and I did that by saying that diseases on the earth were cumulative. So back when everything started, there were probably very few diseases, and as time went on, there were more and more. So possibly in the beginning or the earlier times, people lived longer. Although when we go back in time, we find that people didn't live as long. And they live longer now, actually, because of our medicine and our scientific techniques, and we take care of ourselves better, at least most of us do, and we eat the right things. And again, most of us do, or many of us do. So I have trouble with the logic of anyone living that long. I also wanted to mention, we talked about Cain killing Abel. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve, but Adam and Eve had other children, and their next child was called Zeph. And he's important to this story because Noah was actually supposedly a direct descendant of Zeph. And they make mention of the fact that there was the line of Cain's descendants and a line of Seth's descendants, and Cain's descendants were not considered as good as Seth's, as were closer to God and following the teaching. Cain obviously killed his own brother, so that wasn't a good beginning from that line of descent. But as we read Noah's Ark, it appears that all the people on the earth are evil except for Noah and his direct family, which is one of the first problems I have with the story. But like I said, I wanted to put things into the proper respect. It says that Noah was born 1,056 years after the creation, and he was 600 years old when the flood came. And again, the Bible is basically giving us this information either directly or explaining the list of descendants. Now, the idea of a flood was not new to this area. And I should point out that I do believe there was a flood. I just don't believe it was a flood that covered the entire earth. And of course, God could have just told Noah that this is what was happening. But back then, people didn't really have a conception of how big the earth was. They basically considered the areas where they lived as their entire world. So when they spoke of a flood, not necessarily just talking about Noah here, but people in general, it was their whole world, but it was really just the region that they lived in. And I believe that's probably where this story of Noah came from, that there probably was a flood, but it was a regional flood. It was the area that they knew. And there was actually a story where this might have come from, or this might have been a story that came after Noah, or Noah came after it. There was a story, some ancient Sumerian story, and this is the same area where Adam and Eve and the children and descendants were living near the Euphrates. And there was a story of a king named Gilgamesh, and he was from a town called Erech, Erech, and there was a great flood, and he had saved himself and his family and some of his livestock on a ship that he had built, or that he possessed. So this is very similar. Speaking of similarities, the Muslim Quran also has a flood story, and it's very similar to the Noah story. As a matter of fact, the person in that story's name is spelled Nuh, and it is so similar to the Noah story, it seems like it's a retelling. Or maybe the Noah story in the Bible is retelling the Muslim story. But anyway, this story was around. So there's quite a bit of evidence that there probably was a flood in the Middle East and the areas where these folks lived. Now, it could have been due to rain, as the Bible indicates. It could come from another source. It could even have been something off the wall, like a meteorite striking. If you remember our science, the dinosaurs became extinct, scientists believe, when a meteor struck the Earth, and only the smaller creatures survived. So the idea of a meteor striking and causing a flood is a possibility. It may not be probable, but it's possible. But anyway, I just wanted to keep all that in mind. And most people have heard of the Noah story, even those that aren't that religious. And as I said, a lot of folks that question the Bible or just outright atheists always go straight to Genesis with these stories, and particularly with the Noah story. a comedian that I have to admit, he's one of my favorites, is Ricky Gervais, and he's an atheist. I was watching his show last night that he had, and he actually had his storybook when he was in Sunday school as a young boy. And it was a very simple version of Noah's Ark. And he actually put it up, he projected it so the whole audience could see it. And as most children's stories are, it's mostly a picture book, but there was writing as well. And he just went through the story and poked fun at how ridiculous the idea was. One of the big things was how many creatures there are in the world, and how could that many creatures fit on the ark? And that's valid. As I said, if this was just a regional flood and Noah was just trying to save his family and his livestock, similar to the Gilgamesh story, I think that's totally reasonable. And I don't fault him. He's very funny, Ricky Gervais, and he made some very good points. The reason this isn't really one of my favorite stories, I do like the Bible stories because, as I said, they teach us lessons. A reason why this isn't really one of my favorites is the premise that everybody on the earth is evil, all the descendants of Adam and Eve. And again, just to throw a little more confusion into this, when they talk about Adam and Eve and they talk about Cain going off and having a wife and having descendants, and the same with Seth, really, you have to ask, well, where's these wives coming from? And that's something that people who are poking fun at Genesis always bring up. The Bible kind of indirectly suggests that God created other people after the story of Adam and Eve. But it doesn't directly say that. But I think that's what the Bible is kind of indicating. But anyway, so you could say that there were other descendants involved too. But anyway, the idea is everyone on the earth is evil, except for Noah and except for his family. And God is basically going to kill everyone except Noah and his family and the animals that Noah brings on the ark. And obviously, the ark is kind of a reset of the Adam and Eve story. Basically, God wants to start all over. So the idea is you have a pair of every creature that exists. And again, if you look at every creature that exists throughout the world, we don't really know what creatures were created when, but we do know from fossil evidence that there are a whole lot of creatures around the world. And the idea that they all came to the Middle East to get on this ark is obviously ridiculous. So it's easy to poke fun at it. But from the people's point of view who wrote the Bible and the original folks who were telling these stories, it was reasonable because they were just looking at their world in that isolated area. But anyway, this is pretty cruel. And I as I said, God, and we believed God loved all the animals and all the life that he created. I could kind of understand what he'd be angry with some humans because we're human beings and we know there are evil humans. Cain was a good example who did a terrible act. But I think if you look at the human race, it's more shades of gray. Even back then, the idea that they were all evil enough that they should be killed and dying by drowning is not a pleasant way to die. And putting that aside for a moment, killing all the animals. Well, yes, he saved a male and a female of the different species so that they could restart the world again. But all those other animals that were perfectly innocent, they were just living their life the way they were meant to. They went through that same pain of drowning. So, as I said, I don't like this story. Even if you whether you take it literally or just as a parable, um, I don't think it's one of the better stories. I like the creation story, even though I didn't take it literally, and the story of Adam and Eve, even though I didn't take it literally, and there were some lessons there, and the poetry was beautiful, and all throughout the Bible, it's just the poetry and the beauty of the words and the prose. Um, there's no book that even comes close to it. But anyway, this story I'm not a fan of. And I'm just going to briefly go over it. I think most people kind of know this story. So basically, God, he warned the human race that get your act together or I will punish you. And he gave them time to do it. And apparently they didn't. And then he told Noah to build this ark. They use the word ark several places in the Bible. They end up using it later when we speak of Moses. It's a boat or a box. The ark there was when the Ten Commandments were given to Moses, and I'm going to get that later, obviously. Whoops. No, that wasn't an earthquake. I just kicked the stand. They called where the Ten Commandments were kept an ark of the covenant. So that's a term that's used. And God apparently gave Noah strict instructions on how large it should be. Was it large enough for all the animals in the world outside of the Middle East? Absolutely not. There were 3 decks, or if it was a house, it'd be called stories, but in a ship, we call them decks. And Noah didn't go out and round up these animals. Basically, God, through his greatness, was able to inform the animals to come to the ark and go on the ark. So they came on their own. And at the time Noah was building the ark, his neighbors obviously thought he was crazy, and they ridiculed him. And he warned them, what was coming, but they didn't take him seriously. And then all the animals got on the ark, and they had provisions, and the family was on the ark. There was a big door on the side, which they closed. Like I said, there's more details in the Bible, but I'm just giving you a summarized version. And then it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the world flooded, and all the people died, and all the animals died. And Noah and their family watched it happen. And apparently, since it was God's will, they didn't make any efforts to save anyone. Then after the rain stopped, Noah, to find out whether the water had receded long enough to leave the ark, he set out first a raven, a bird called a raven, and to scout to see if there was any dry land. The raven came back, and there was nothing. And then he sent out a dove, and the same result. And then 7 days later, he sent out the dove again, and the dove came back with an olive branch, which indicated there was an olive tree somewhere, and that life was replenishing itself on the earth. Noah landed the ark. Now, some people say he landed on Mount Ararat, but actually it was a region called Ararat, and there was a mountain in that region. So he landed the ark in that region and opened the door and freed the animals, and life began all over again. And God put up a rainbow, apparently for the first time, and the rainbow was a promise by God to the human race that he would never do anything like this again. Okay. So that's basically the story. And just because I don't know if everyone's seen all my episodes, just to reinforce, I am a Christian. I do believe in God. I believe that Jesus was the Son of God and our Savior, and I do follow his teachings. I love the Bible, and there's great lessons in the Bible, and some of the stories are like a reporter would report what's happening. Other stories were passed down mouth to mouth, and you have to decide for yourself the validity of them. I think the stories with Jesus are documented much better. There were a lot of witnesses, but we'll get to that when we get to Jesus. But I also believe in science, and when I say I believe in science, I believe that God gave us the intelligence to try to understand the complexity of his creation, of the world around us, which is very complicated. That's another reason I believe in God, because it can't just be an accident. So I love God and I love science. And science I see as humanity's attempt to understand God's creation. And in science, there are theories and there are facts. And theories are basically opinions where there aren't enough facts yet to support it and call it a scientific fact or a scientific law. So with the theories, I use a grain of salt. But for example, the age of the Earth, I think it's pretty well documented that the Earth is 4 billion years old or so. So the idea that as the Bible states, that it's only 6,000 years old, I don't think is realistic. So I also point out that human beings wrote the Bible. I'm sure they were inspired by God. And as I said, some of the parts of the Bible are direct reports from people who were there and witnessed things. But because human beings were involved, and it wasn't written by God and sent down to us directly, we should use our common sense and interpret it for ourselves. I also point out that originally the Christian church was the Catholic Church, and people had problems with some of the Catholic ideas, so they interpreted the Bible differently, and that was the Protestant Reformation. So what I'm talking about isn't anything new. So I just wanted to say that to bring people kind of up to date. Okay, so that's basically Noah's Ark, and take it as you will. I think it's interesting when you look at some of the historic accounts of the time and try to piece together where this story came from and interpret it the way you feel comfortable interpreting it, which is basically what I did. And although there are times in the Bible where God's kind of tough on how he punishes sin, this was the worst. And I think that's why they mentioned the rainbow, just to kind of let people know, okay, he's not going to do this again. Not to this extent. Okay, so really, that's all I had to say about that. I also kind of talk about current events and what's going on. And as I've mentioned to people, just being straightforward, America is kind of divided, to say the least. So people would say, is this guy a Democrat or Republican or an independent? I used to call myself an independent for the longest time. But then since I always voted Republican, actually it was just a few years ago, I said, okay, I'm just going to register Republican. Let me just be honest. The only time I voted Democrat was for Jimmy Carter. And although I think he was a very nice man and intelligent, I don't think he was a very good president. He was kind of an outsider because it came right after the Nixon Watergate thing. He followed Gerald Ford, and he really didn't have the knowledge of Washington, D.C. to get things done. And he only had one term. After that, I did vote for Reagan, as many people did. Anyway, just to let you know where I'm coming from, that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. I don't think Democrats are bad people. We just have a difference of opinion. So I just want to say that up forward. I wanted to mention the war in Iran, which is really been, I wouldn't call it a stalemate, but I'm not sure how it's going to be resolved. Fortunately, there are no men on the ground, and Trump has no intention of putting men on the ground, from what he's said and what he's done. There was and is a real threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon because they have a government that is, their leaders are Muslim, and not saying things wrong with Muslims, but when you have leadership that are basically ministers, people who represent a religion, they're making decisions based on that religion. And if they're interpreting their religion in a bad way, that could be problematic. And as I think most people would agree, Iran is a terrorist state, and it's a distorted view of the Muslim religion. I said, I think in my first episode, that there's over 2 billion Muslims, and there's only like 2 million that have been radicalized. I think they're called the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran is part of that. So it's very dangerous to have a country that's run by people that believe in terrorism and that believe in killing people that don't follow their religion, for that government to have a nuclear weapon. And all our presidents have tried to prevent them from having it, and they've tried to do it diplomatically, but Iran has always gone back on every deal that they've made. And it came to the point where our intelligence services told Trump they're going to have a nuclear weapon in weeks, that we have to do something. And the Israelis were already planning to bomb them, and they did start bombing them, but the nuclear sites were deep underground, and they needed us to assist because we have a bomb called a bunker buster that can go deep and destroy those. And most people agreed that what Trump did. There's a lot of never Trumpers that just disagree with everything he does. But it's a real threat that both Democrats and Republicans have realized, and he felt it came to the point where you need to do something. But later on, Iran began to rebuild, so the war picked up again, basically. And Trump's been trying diplomatically to stop it, and there's been ceasefire, but Iran has gone after ships in the Strait of Hormuz that are trying to bring oil in and out, which Trump knows he needs to prevent, and he's doing everything he can to do that. It's just whenever he makes an agreement with them and they say they're going to stop shooting tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, they don't. I think their leadership's in disarray because many of them had been killed. And it's a question who's in charge. But that's kind of where we are right now. So, and I believe, and Trump has stopped the fighting again because he's in negotiation. So we'll see how that goes. The reason it's important because of the things I've stated, but also midterm elections are coming up. And since gas prices have gone up due to this war, that's going to hurt the Republicans. At the same time, there's a socialist and communist movement in the Democratic Party that many of the Democrats are for. I think it's over 50%. But the independents and the Republicans obviously are very much against it. So what's happening is some of these socialists / communists are doing well in the primaries, but the Democrats are worried they won't do well in the general elections. So I don't know how the midterms are going to go. The war and the gas prices are going to hurt the Republicans, but I think the socialist movement's going to kind of help them. So we'll have to wait and see. So that's kind of what's going on right now. I didn't get into any great details because it looks like my half hour is up. I apologize, I kicked my stand. Maybe some people thought I was having an earthquake here and somebody was upset with some of the things I was saying today, but that wasn't the case. As I said, my podcast is just for folks to keep an open mind. And those folks who say, I don't believe in God because I believe in science, I'm really hoping you see my point of view, that you can believe in both, that you can interpret the Bible and God in your own way using common sense. And if you get to the point where you believe in God and accept Jesus as your Savior and as the Son of God and follow his teachings, you can be a Christian without going to church every Sunday and following a particular Christian religion. It's totally up to you. As you can see, I love to read. I'm not one of those people who picks up the Bible every time I want to make a decision. I believe in thinking for yourself, but the Bible is a good book to pick up and help you make life decisions. I do call it my compass. And everyone, specifically Jesus' teachings, and everyone should have a compass in their life, not just make decisions based on your own personal self-interest, because that doesn't lead to a happy and successful life. If you are an ethical person and follow rules that are common sense, I think, and will lead you to being a good person and be a trusted person with your friends and your coworkers and everyone around you, I think that'll benefit you in the long run. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. It's really these early stories in Genesis that I have trouble taking literally. And as we go, there'll be stories and I'll look at the historic content, and I may not be as strict in following the line that taking it literally shouldn't be done. I think a lot of stories in the Bible you can take literally, and you should. It's just these earlier ones, I think we do have to use our common sense and our knowledge of the world as we know it. Anyway, God bless. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.